There is a kind of strength that doesn't feel strong at all. It feels normal. It feels like being the one who adjusts first, the one who understands, the one who doesn't make things harder than they already are. You learn early how to stay composed, how to read a room before speaking, how to sense what's needed before anyone asks. Your body does it automatically. Shoulders tighten without you noticing. Breath shortens just enough to stay alert. Your attention moves outward, scanning, accommodating, absorbing. People call this maturity, responsibility, emotional intelligence. And for a long time, it works. You become reliable, functional, someone others lean on. But there's a quiet moment that's harder to name. Not a breakdown, not exhaustion, just a subtle pause where something feels off. It happens in small places. When you say yes before checking yourself. When you ignore discomfort because it feels inconvenient. When your needs register, but don't last long enough to matter. There's no drama in it. No obvious pain. Just a sense that responding has become easier than choosing. That carrying feels lighter than stopping. That staying useful feels safer than staying present. And maybe you've never questioned this. Because nothing looks wrong from the outside. You're still standing, still functioning, still doing what's expected. So the thought doesn't arrive as a question. It arrives as a weight. Not what's wrong with me, but something quieter, something closer to. When did this become normal? It doesn't happen all at once. There isn't a single moment you can point to. It forms slowly, across years, in patterns so familiar they feel like personality. You're the one who notices tension before it turns into conflict. The one who smooths things over without being asked. The one who senses what others need and quietly adjusts. You don't do this because you want praise. You do it because it feels natural. Because letting things escalate feels heavier than absorbing them. Over time, this becomes your position in the world. You're the listener, the stabilizer, the one people turn to when things fall apart. And you rarely think of yourself as giving something up. It just feels like being capable. The body adapts before the mind does. You stay alert even when resting. Your attention remains outward, tuned to shifts in mood, tone, silence. You can feel when someone is uncomfortable before they say a word. You know when to hold back, when to step in, when to stay quiet. And most days, this works. Until it doesn't. Not because something dramatic happens, but because the same small moments keep repeating. You agree before checking how you feel. You delay what you need because someone else needs something now. You dismiss discomfort because it feels minor compared to everything else going on. And slowly, a pattern forms. Your needs don't disappear. They just stop interrupting. They show up as a faint signal and fade quickly. As if they learned not to stay too long. As if they learned they won't be answered anyway. You might notice it in the simplest ways. Choosing what's easiest instead of what's right for you. Feeling relieved when plans are cancelled. Not because you wanted rest, but because you didn't want to explain yourself. There's a strange kind of calm in this. A quiet efficiency. Life keeps moving. Responsibilities get handled. People rely on you. From the outside, nothing looks broken. But inside, something subtle shifts. You stop asking certain questions. Not because you found the answers, but because asking feels unnecessary. It's easier to adapt than to pause. Easier to be needed than to be honest. Easier to stay useful than to risk being inconvenient. And the most confusing part is this. You don't feel unhappy. You don't feel lost. You feel reduced. As if a smaller version of yourself learned how to survive. And took over quietly. No collapse. No rebellion. Just repetition. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to tell. Where care for others ends. And neglect of yourself begins. At some point, repetition loses its tension. not because it resolves, but because it becomes inefficient. What once felt automatic starts to require effort, and that effort no longer feels justified. There's no decision behind it, no internal declaration, no moment of clarity. Something simply stops volunteering. The body hesitates where it used to rush. Attention pauses where it once moved outward without question. You still respond. You still show up. But the extra movement, the part of you that reached ahead of the moment, is no longer there. At first, this feels strange, almost wrong. You notice yourself answering later than usual, not out of avoidance, not out of resentment, just because the urgency doesn't arrive the same way. Conversations shorten. You don't add unnecessary context. You don't soften edges automatically. There's no emotional charge attached to this. No relief. No guilt. Just neutrality. This neutrality doesn't announce itself as change. It's easy to mistake it for distraction, for tiredness, for a temporary dip in engagement. But it has a different texture. It doesn't pull you away from life. It simply stops pulling you toward what no longer holds weight. You notice it in moments that used to activate you automatically. Someone speaks, and you register the tone, but your body doesn't lean forward. A situation tightens slightly, and you sense it, but the familiar urge to stabilize the atmosphere doesn't arrive. There's a fraction of a second where the old movement almost begins. Then it doesn't. Not because you resist it, because there's no internal pressure pushing it into motion. This absence can feel unsettling. You may question whether you're becoming careless, whether you're disengaging from something important. But the absence doesn't feel empty. It feels unused, like a muscle that hasn't been called upon. The body holds itself differently during this phase. Your posture doesn't anticipate. Your breath doesn't brace. There's less forward tension, less readiness to compensate for what hasn't happened yet. You begin to notice how much of your previous effort was not about responding to what was present, but about preventing what might occur. This is where time stretches. Moments linger without requiring input. Silences remain intact. You no longer rush to fill them, and that can feel strangely exposed. Not vulnerable, just unprotected by habit. You might notice that situations resolve without you, or that they don't, and nothing collapses as a result. This creates a quiet confusion, because the effort that once felt essential now appears optional, and yet you haven't replaced it with intention. You're not choosing differently. You're simply not being pulled. This is the danger of the interval. It can look like indifference, or avoidance, or emotional withdrawal, but internally, it feels more precise than that. The psyche hasn't turned away from the world. It has paused its advance. It's watching what happens when it doesn't intervene. And what happens is often less dramatic than expected. Some tensions dissipate on their own. Some misunderstandings remain unresolved. And the world keeps moving. This realization doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as recalibration, a subtle shift in how much force you apply, relative to how much is actually required. You begin to sense that the old level of effort was never a measure of care, but of conditioning. And once that conditioning loosens, the body doesn't rush to replace it. It waits, not passively, precisely. The kind of neutrality that appears when a mechanism has been overused and quietly shuts itself down. You still notice tension in a room. You simply don't move to correct it. You still sense shifts in tone. You just don't absorb them into your body. This is not detachment, and it doesn't feel like withdrawal. It feels like something stepping back, without asking permission. Time begins to change texture. Days feel flatter. Weeks pass without the usual internal accounting. You don't replay interactions as much. You don't rehearse explanations afterward. Not because you've grown indifferent, but because the impulse doesn't activate. There's a moment when you start to wonder if you've become less caring. You observe your own behavior with mild confusion. You notice what's missing before you understand why. But when you check inwardly, there's no pain where the effort used to be. Just space. Contained. Unclaimed. This is where the experience becomes ambiguous. From the outside, it can look like stability, like maturity, like calm. And in some ways, it is. You're no longer pulled by every emotional fluctuation around you. You're no longer organizing yourself around what's needed next. But nothing has replaced that movement yet. You haven't chosen a new way of being. You haven't articulated a boundary. You haven't redefined yourself. You're standing between versions. The old pattern no longer operates. The new one hasn't formed. People may sense the shift before you name it. They might say you're quieter, more distant, harder to read. You don't argue with that. Not because it's accurate, but because correcting it doesn't feel necessary. There's no reflex to explain who you are anymore. No urge to clarify intentions. No pressure to smooth the perception. And that absence is noticeable. Because for a long time, explaining was part of staying connected. Now, it feels optional. There's a subtle risk here. This stillness can be mistaken for completion, for resolution, for having arrived somewhere. But nothing has resolved. You haven't recovered something. You haven't found an answer. You've simply stopped performing a role that once kept everything in motion. The world hasn't changed. Your relationships haven't been renegotiated. Your life still looks mostly the same. What's different is the absence of a reflex. The automatic reach outward is gone. Not replaced by insight. Not replaced by intention. Just absent. And while nothing feels urgent, nothing feels settled either. This isn't a collapse. It's an interval. A pause where the familiar way of moving through the world has ended, and whatever comes next has not yet taken shape. There is a way to look at this interval without turning it into a lesson, not as improvement, not as regression, but as a shift in how the psyche protects itself. Carl Jung noticed something similar in people who had carried too much for too long. He didn't describe it as burnout. He didn't frame it as healing. He observed it as a withdrawal of psychic energy, not a collapse, a reallocation. When a pattern has served its function past its limit, the psyche doesn't argue with it. It doesn't negotiate. It simply stops supplying energy. The outer behavior may look almost the same. The inner charge does not. What you experienced in the previous stage wasn't detachment from others. It was detachment from a role. Jung called this kind of role a persona, not a mask in the theatrical sense, but a structure built to meet the world's expectations. Personas are not false. They are functional. They form where adaptation is required early, where being attuned, responsible, or emotionally available becomes necessary for belonging. Over time, the persona becomes efficient, reliable, convincing, and dangerous, because the more energy it absorbs, the less remains available for the inner center it was meant to protect. Jung observed that when this imbalance grows too large, the psyche begins to compensate, not by breaking the persona, but by draining it. That's why the change didn't feel dramatic. There was no rebellion, no sudden assertion of needs, no conscious boundary setting. The energy simply stopped flowing outward at the same rate. From the inside, this feels like neutrality. From the outside, it can look like distance. But psychologically, it's neither. It's the system correcting a long-standing asymmetry. This is also why the stillness felt risky. The persona had been doing important work, maintaining harmony, preventing conflict, keeping relationships stable. When its energy supply decreases, the psyche hasn't yet redirected that energy elsewhere. It's a holding phase. Jung paid close attention to what happens when adaptation becomes indistinguishable from identity. Not the dramatic adaptations, but the quiet ones that form early and remain unquestioned. When a person learns, often too young, that stability depends on being attuned, helpful, or emotionally available, the psyche builds around that requirement, not as a choice, as a necessity. Over time, this adaptation stops feeling like a response to circumstances and starts feeling like who you are. Jung warned that this is where the greatest confusion appears, because the persona doesn't feel false. It feels earned. It carries real competence, real sensitivity, real relational intelligence. But its cost is subtle. The psyche begins to confuse functioning with being, effectiveness with worth, responsiveness with connection. And the more energy this structure absorbs, the less capacity remains for anything that does not serve immediate adaptation. Jung observed that the psyche does not protest this imbalance emotionally. It compensates energetically. That's why the shift you experienced didn't arrive as insight. There was no realization that said, "This is costing me too much." The psyche simply began to withdraw investment from the pattern. In Jung's view, this withdrawal is not pathology. It's regulation, a way the system prevents further erosion of what he called the inner center, the organizing principle that exists prior to roles, expectations, and survival strategies. This is also why the change feels confusing rather than liberating. The persona hasn't been replaced. It has only been deprived of excess energy. So you remain capable, functional, socially intelligible, but less compelled. Jung described this as a moment when the psyche stops negotiating with the environment and begins listening inwardly, not for instructions, but for limits. What no longer fits does not announce itself as wrong. It simply fails to energize. Tasks that once felt obligatory now feel optional. Emotional labor that once felt necessary now feels heavy. Not unbearable, just disproportionate. This disproportion is important because it signals that the psyche has begun to calculate cost. Not consciously, structurally. Jung believed this calculation was essential for individuation, but he also warned that many people never reach this stage. They continue adapting long past necessity, long past usefulness. They mistake endurance for depth, and sacrifice for meaning. The interruption you're in now marks the first deviation from that path, not toward freedom, not toward clarity, but away from automatic self-neglect. The psyche is no longer willing to finance a structure that consumes more than it preserves, and that refusal creates a gap between who you've been trained to be and what remains when the training loosens. This gap is not yet integration. It is space, and space, in Jung's work, always precedes reorientation. Jung described these moments as transitional states. Periods where the old orientation no longer organizes life, but the new one hasn't emerged. They are uncomfortable not because something is wrong, but because something familiar is no longer in charge. This helps explain the confusion you noticed. Why you didn't feel better. Why you didn't feel worse. Why you felt contained, but undefined. The psyche wasn't asking you to act. It was asking you to stop repeating. In Jung's terms, this is where the self begins to exert pressure, not as an idea, not as insight, but as a reduction of what no longer fits. The self doesn't shout. It withdraws permission. It removes energy from patterns that cost too much relative to what they return. That's why the old reflex didn't come back. Not because you decided to change, but because the psyche decided not to finance that movement anymore. This is not individuation. Not yet. It's the precondition. A clearing. An interruption in adaptation that creates space for something more central to emerge later. Jung warned that many people misinterpret this phase. They assume they've become cold, or selfish, or disconnected. Others around them may reinforce that perception. But psychologically, what's happening is more precise. The psyche is pausing its outward negotiation. to prevent further erosion of the inner center. Nothing has been integrated. Nothing has been resolved. But the automatic sacrifice has been interrupted. And that interruption matters. Because for the first time in a long time, the energy that once went exclusively outward is no longer fully spoken for. It hasn't returned inward yet, but it's no longer lost. What comes after interruption is not clarity, at least, not the kind people expect. There isn't a moment where everything makes sense. No insight that rearranges your life. No declaration of who you are now. What arrives instead is quieter. You begin to notice small shifts that don't announce themselves as change. Mornings feel less rushed, even when nothing in your schedule has moved. Conversations feel shorter, not because you're withholding, but because you no longer feel compelled to add what isn't necessary. You pause before responding, not to calculate, not to protect, but because the reflex to fill space hasn't returned. Your body occupies itself differently. Shoulders drop without intention. Breath deepens without instruction. There's no sense of achievement attached to this. No feeling of having improved. Just a subtle reduction in noise. You still care. You still notice others. But the movement is no longer automatic. Care no longer requires disappearance. And that's unfamiliar. At first, the unfamiliar feels empty. You might mistake it for loss. The old pattern was loud, constant, reliable. This new state doesn't demand anything. It doesn't ask you to act. It doesn't ask you to decide. It simply exists. You begin to recognize how much of your previous sense of self was organized around responding, around being needed, around staying functional. Without that constant orientation outward, there's space, but it's undefined. An undefined space can feel unsettling. You may notice moments where you almost step back into the old role, where your body leans forward out of habit. Then it stops, not forcefully, not consciously, as if something inside you checks the cost, before allowing the movement. This isn't discipline, and it isn't control. It's a boundary that hasn't been verbalized yet. Life continues much the same. People still relate to you in familiar ways. Expectations don't disappear overnight. But something in you no longer organizes itself around meeting them first. You don't announce this. You don't explain it. There's no urge to. Because explanation belonged to the old pattern. What replaces it is a quieter presence. Less reactive. Less available. More centered. Though you might not use that word yet. It's not confidence, and it's not withdrawal. It's the absence of self-erasure. You don't feel triumphant about this. You don't feel relieved. You feel steady, and steadiness doesn't perform. It doesn't reassure others. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply holds. This holding doesn't announce itself as strength. There's no pride in it. No sense of having finally arrived somewhere. If anything, it feels unfinished. You may notice moments where the old reflex almost returns. A familiar tightening, a familiar readiness to step forward, and then something in you checks the movement, not with resistance, with hesitation, as if the body pauses long enough to ask whether the cost is still worth paying. Often, the answer isn't clear, so nothing happens. You remain where you are. This can feel awkward. You might wonder if you're becoming passive, if you're losing something that once made you effective. But effectiveness was never the same as presence, and presence doesn't rush. You may find yourself sitting with moments longer than before, letting discomfort exist without immediately translating it into action. Not because you're stronger, but because the urgency has faded. This creates an unfamiliar rhythm. Life doesn't speed up or slow down. It simply stops revolving around response. Some days, this feels like relief. Other days, it feels like emptiness. Neither feeling lasts. What remains is a steadier contact with what's actually happening, inside and outside, And that contact doesn't demand interpretation yet. It doesn't ask you to decide who you are becoming. It only asks that you stay where you are, without disappearing. There are moments when this stillness feels incomplete, as if something important hasn't arrived yet. That's because it hasn't. Integration doesn't begin with answers. It begins with the capacity to remain present, without defaulting to adaptation, without filling, without sacrificing. This is not the end of a process. It's not even the beginning of a new one. It's the moment between movements, where the old way of surviving has loosened its grip, and the new orientation has not yet declared itself. You may be tempted to rush this space, to name it, to turn it into identity, but it resists that, because what's forming here doesn't need to be defined yet. It only needs room. And perhaps that's the quiet shift you've been noticing all along. Not the urge to become someone else, but the ability to stop leaving yourself behind. Nothing more. Nothing concluded. Just the absence of what once cost you too much, and the silence that remains when you no longer pay that price.